Welcome back, and in today's lesson we're going to take a look at the multi-column CSS3 module. And this is a really neat way where we can create newspaper-like columns with plain CSS. So I've created our beginning demo. If I open it up in Chrome, you can see we have the Envato logo and just a bit of text to simulate maybe about us. And our job is to turn what we have right here into columns. And you're going to find out with CSS3, it's really easy. So let's open up our editor and take a look. Here is the HTML page, the Envato logo, about us, and a paragraph. Next, if I go to the style, you can see that we've set a width to the body and essentially centered this on the page. Fairly standard, right? All right, so now we're going to make the paragraph into columns. So I'm going to be very generalized here, and I'll simply do P. However, likely you'll want to be more targeted, whether you're using a class or maybe referencing a container first. And I will say WebKit column. And we have two different options here. We can specify a width or a count. So if I say count 3, I'm saying get all of the paragraphs on the page and you're going to separate them into 3 columns. And then the browser will be responsible for determining exactly what the width is. So if I reload, wow, isn't it that easy? If I decide I only need 2, simple. All the way up to 6. You can do as many as you want, but of course, that doesn't look very good. I'll move this back to 3. Now, one thing I want you to be aware of, and this is one downside, especially if you're working with dynamically generated content, maybe from a CMS, is it's going to generate 3 columns no matter what. So even if our paragraph is something really short like this, I reload, you can see it's still going to separate that. So you could use a bit of JavaScript to determine the length of the text, but if you want to rely just on CSS, you might want to ensure that you know what content is being divided into columns. So let's return this to the full length and take a look at some other options. If I go back to style.css, we can also specify a width, like so. And now if I say 100 pixels, I'm saying I want you to separate this text into columns, and each column should be 100 pixels, and you determine how many columns will be displayed. Now if I reload, you can see each one is 100 pixels, and it divides itself into 4. If I were to say 200, that'll probably be 2 columns. Now, we can also use a shorthand. So rather than WebKit column count or column width, I can say WebKit columns. And then if I were to say 3, it's smart enough to know that I'm referring to count. So if I were to reload, we get 3. Alternatively, if I were to say 100 pixels, once again, it knows we're specifying a width, so it's going to use column width. So in this case, this is identical to what we have right here. If I were to set it to 3, that would be identical to what we have there. And just to make sure, 100 pixels, there we are. Now, what if we want to specify the gap between each one? Right here, you can see it uses a default of maybe 10 to 20 pixels. We can override that though, and I can say WebKit column gap. And let's set it to a large number, 50 pixels. And now you can see it still keeps 4 columns, but it makes sure that there is a 50 pixel gap. Now, if I set this to 100 pixels and I reload, you can see that we have a 100 pixel gap, and that brings it down to 3 columns. We could override that and say, got to be 4 columns no matter what, but make sure that the width is short enough that we can still have a 100 pixel gap between each one. Of course, that doesn't look great, so let's bring it down to 2. And make the column gap either the default by removing it entirely or setting it to around 20 pixels. Now, it's important to note that at the time of this recording, you can't get away with something like this. You still need to be using the vendor prefixes, because if I refresh, you can see that's not taking effect. So we will want to make sure that we have the official form and the vendor prefix form. So we have WebKit Mozilla and the official, and then you'll do the same thing here. So we'll change that to Moz and the official form. And that way we're going to work in Chrome, Firefox, Safari, and Internet Explorer when it begins to support it with the official form. And there you have it, the CSS3 multi-column module.